Today you're going to hear a true story, so absurd that it sounds like fiction. A plot where imagination and reality intertwine so deeply that it becomes almost impossible to tell where the dream begins and where the concrete world ends. Imagine, for a moment, someone deciding they are not satisfied with simply being a citizen of a country, living under already raised flags, carrying official and recognized passports. Imagine someone who, instead, chooses to create their own empire, alone, without soldiers, without subjects, without palaces, and yet carrying all the pomp and conviction expected of a sovereign. This is the story of a man who founded what he called his personal empire and who, in a nearly unbelievable twist, almost managed to have his passport accepted as legitimate by real-world authorities. It's fascinating how stories like this always attract us. Perhaps because, deep down, we all harbor the secret desire to own a space that is entirely ours, a territory free from the rules imposed by others. Some find this refuge in small gardens, in hidden diaries, in imaginary worlds that exist only within the mind. But this man, unlike most, decided to transform fantasy into something tangible. He proclaimed himself emperor of lands he believed forgotten and devoted himself to giving form and symbols to this invention. As you listen, allow your breathing to slow down. There is no rush. This story is not just about a passport or about borders. It's about how human imagination, when taken to its furthest consequences, can transform ordinary life into a silent and unexpected theater. Close your eyes if you wish, and picture an old map, the kind drawn with crooked lines, filled with blank spaces where the cartographers of the past would write the phrase terra incognita. It was in these voids, in these corners that escaped official cartography, that dreams like this man's could be born. A one-man empire may seem, at first glance, like a joke, an eccentric gesture, and maybe it is. But as we dive into this narrative, you will realize there was much more behind it. There was a silent critique of political structures, a deep longing for belonging, and also a certain childlike charm, almost playful, that transformed documents into relics and stamps into symbols of power. With each detail, you will be invited to reflect. What gives legitimacy to a country? What makes a piece of paper, like a passport, worthy of opening borders? Is it the ink used, the signature, or is it simply the collective belief that it has value? The protagonist of our story believed that faith in a symbol could be enough. If he carried with him a beautiful passport, well designed, sealed with his own coat of arms, why shouldn't he be able to cross borders like any other traveler? The simple act of presenting this document was a poetic rehearsal of the fragility of human conventions. And, surprisingly, on at least one occasion, it almost worked. Before we move on, it's important to set the right atmosphere. Picture the scene: a man, alone in his room, perhaps under the dim light of a lamp, drawing on sheets of paper, sketching flags that would never be raised on official masts. He drafts coats of arms with symbols only he understands. He writes proclamations full of solemnity, as if founding a new era. To the world, all of this might seem nothing more than a delusion. But to him, each detail carried weight, each document had a soul. This is the starting point of our narrative, a man's conviction in his own invention. An empire of one, built not on land but on ideas, sustained not by armies, but by persistence. And what's most intriguing is that this empire, though fictitious, left traces in the real world. It left behind papers, newspaper stories, and above all, a question that still resonates today. How far are we willing to believe in symbols, even when we know they were invented? In this first chapter, you begin to see the setting, though not yet the protagonist in all his details. He will reveal himself gradually, like someone who does not rush, who prefers to be discovered step by step, with the same calm rhythm of your breathing now. And as the next topics lead us from fantasy to the discovery of disputed lands, you'll realize that this story, although marked by absurdity, is also a deep portrait of the human desire to belong and to be recognized. Before we continue, I'd like to invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think of this initial idea? Have you ever imagined having a space that was entirely your own, as if it were your own private country? Sharing this in the comments helps enrich the conversation and bring new perspectives. And if you're enjoying this calm atmosphere and these improbable stories that feel like they've stepped out of a dream, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. That way, you help keep alive stories like this one, which deserve to be told in a tranquil and reflective way. And now, with this invitation made and the ground prepared, we move on to the next chapter. There, we'll explore the fascinating question of lands without owners, forgotten spaces in the official world that made it possible for a one-man empire to be born. In the last part of this narrative, you discovered the initial idea of a man who decided to create a private empire, alone, sustained only by symbols, conviction, and imagination. But every creation needs a setting, a territory to support it, even if that territory is not recognized by official maps. To better understand what motivated this gesture, we need to travel back to a time when there were still spaces with undefined borders, places forgotten or abandoned by the great powers. These were the so-called ownerless lands, and they nourished the dreams of adventurers, dreamers, and visionaries. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the world went through an intense process of border delimitation. Treaties were signed, lines were drawn, flags were raised over mountains, deserts, and islands. Yet, no matter how much the powers sought to control every piece of land, gaps always remained, small breaches where the logic of sovereignty seemed unable to reach. These were legally ambiguous spaces, sometimes overlooked in poorly drafted documents, or simply dismissed as uninteresting from an economic perspective. For dreamers, such places were like blank pages, silent invitations to imagine a new order, a refuge against the weight of bureaucracy and the hierarchies of the real world. While traditional empires fought for territory with blood and gunpowder, some people saw in these voids the chance to build peaceful, almost poetic countries, sustained not by force but by creativity. The protagonist of our story was one of these men. When he looked at maps, he did not see just lines and colors. He saw opportunities. He saw the possibility of turning a neglected space into the stage for his imperial fantasy. This fascination with ownerless lands was fed by a mix of romanticism and rebellion. It was as if he were saying to the world, "If you don't want to care for this patch of ground, I will. And by doing so, I will give it a name, a flag, and even a passport." It is interesting to reflect on what gives value to a territory. A patch of sand in the middle of the ocean may seem useless, but when someone decides to give it symbols and stories, it acquires a different weight. The same happens in everyday life. Often, a simple object becomes precious because someone fills it with memories, feelings, and meanings. With a piece of land, it is no different. Our characters seemed to understand this instinctively. As official maps became increasingly precise, ordinary people were still captivated by the idea that gaps existed. It is curious how this notion of empty space stirs something within us, perhaps a desire to start anew, to build a place without a past, where everything can be invented. The fascination with ownerless lands has always been tied to the hope of freedom, autonomy, and even recognition. And it was in this hazy ground, in this space between the real and the imagined, that the idea of a one-man empire began to flourish. Now picture a solitary explorer, walking along a deserted beach, looking toward the horizon and thinking that there, perhaps, could lie the future of an entire country. This scene, though simple, conveys the essence of what moved the protagonist. He didn't need crowds, armies, or mineral wealth. All he needed was the conviction that this forgotten space could become the foundation of his private empire. But there was also something deeper. By proclaiming interest in these lands, the character was not only seeking a physical space. He was seeking a mirror for himself, a way to affirm his identity in a world that perhaps did not offer him enough recognition. Just as artists find a blank canvas for their paintings, he found in disputed territories the chance to project his own existence. This story leads us to reflect on how much borders are, in fact, human inventions. Lines drawn on paper, accepted by convention, but which do not exist in nature. The wind crosses them, rivers flow, animals migrate without asking permission. Only we humans give such weight to invisible lines. The protagonist of our account seemed to want to play with this contradiction. If everything was convention, why not create his own? If the world was made of fragile agreements, why not found an imaginary country that could still be charged with symbols as strong as the official ones? As you take a deep breath and follow this train of thought, notice how the story begins to gain substance. From the simple act of imagining, we move to a concrete possibility. There were ownerless lands, and on them an empire could be built, even if made up of just one person. This fascination with geographic gaps is what will guide the next chapter of our narrative, where we will finally learn more about the man behind the idea. Before we move on, I leave here a gentle invitation. If this calm and reflective atmosphere is pleasing to you, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. This not only strengthens this space but also helps keep alive stories that may seem improbable, yet reveal so much about the human condition. In the next chapter, we will meet the dreamer who decided to become a sovereign. An ordinary man who, by choosing an extraordinary path, turned his life into a narrative that still intrigues us today. As we explored the fascination with ownerless lands, we reached the inevitable point. Every creation needs someone to dream, someone who, faced with emptiness, has the courage to project an entire world of their own. And that is exactly what our protagonist did. He was not a military explorer, nor an influential politician. He possessed neither considerable wealth nor armies at his disposal. He was, essentially, an ordinary man, someone who walked the streets like anyone else, who lived his daily routine, but who, deep within, carried a deep and silent conviction. A conviction capable of transforming reality around him, even if subtly and almost invisibly. The dreamer who became a sovereign did not emerge out of nowhere. His life had been shaped by old maps, travelers' accounts, and stories of forgotten nations. From an early age, he had been fascinated by what lay beyond the control of empires, by the gaps and voids of the world. In him dwelled a mix of curiosity, restlessness, and perhaps a touch of quiet rebellion. He looked at the borders of his time as one looks at ink lines, questioning the solidity of those strokes, wondering whether they could truly prevent someone from daring to think differently. It is not difficult to imagine the first time he decided, silently, to proclaim something to himself. Perhaps it happened on a quiet evening, alone in his room, with soft light reflecting on papers scattered across the floor. He sketched flags, drew coats of arms, and experimented with titles that sounded both strange and majestic. Each gesture was an affirmation of his identity, a way of saying that there was more to the world than what everyday life allowed one to perceive. On paper, he was building something that did not yet exist physically, but that came alive as his conviction grew stronger. What makes this story even more intriguing is realizing how imagination and reality began to intertwine. He was not content with silent dreams. He wanted the world to recognize his creation, even if only partially, even if only as a curiosity. And so, step by step, he began to act like a sovereign. He created his own rules, documents, symbols, and, above all, a coherent narrative that explained to the world, or to anyone willing to listen, that this empire, however improbable, had the right to exist. There is something profoundly human in this gesture. The need for belonging, for creating meaning, for affirming one's own existence in a tangible way. He did not seek military power, nor wealth. He sought legitimacy, recognition, a way to leave his mark in a world that so often ignores individuality. Every invented title, every drawn coat of arms, every written proclamation was an attempt to materialize an identity that would otherwise remain invisible. It is worth noting that, although it might have seemed like an extravagance, the protagonist never lost his calm or his introspection. He did not shout his authority in the streets, nor demand attention from strangers. His empire grew silently, like a rare plant that requires constant and delicate care. He moved patiently, observing every detail, adjusting each document, refining every symbol. Every action, however small, was filled with meaning, as if the simple act of doing proved that his empire was real. Everyday life continued around him, indifferent, and yet, in a way, cooperative. By interacting with maps, legal texts, and legal loopholes, the man found ways to make his creation more concrete, more believable. He understood the fragility of the official world. He knew that symbols, signatures, and stamps carried power because people collectively believed in them. And if collective belief could be bent, then perhaps he could cross the line between fantasy and reality. As you breathe, notice the calm of this process. It is not an impetuous gesture, but a slow and careful construction. Each sheet of paper, each drawing, each written word formed part of a silent mosaic that gradually transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. He was, in a sense, an architect of imagination, building an empire of its own existence alongside the world we know. And so, the dreamer who became a sovereign shows us something subtle yet profound. The creation of a personal space, even if improbable, does not depend on immediate recognition. It depends on patience, persistence, and the conviction that what is dreamed can take form, meaning, and power, even when no one else seems to believe. Before moving forward, reflect on what it means to have a territory entirely your own. Not necessarily a physical one, but symbolic, intimate, charged with identity. Our protagonist found this territory not in official borders, but in the intersection between dream and reality, between paper and imagination. In the next chapter, we will explore how he began the search for the land that would give body to his empire, that delicate and quiet stage where fantasy begins to intertwine with real geography, and where patience and attention to detail become essential for the realization of his sovereignty. After conceiving his empire on paper, with titles, coats of arms, and solemn documents, our protagonist now faced the most delicate challenge: finding a physical territory that could sustain his creation. It was not a matter of choosing just any space, nor of occupying places already organized or administered. He sought a space that, somehow, could be claimed without direct conflicts, a marginal place, forgotten or ignored by political conventions. Such a search requires patience, attention to detail, and an almost poetic sensitivity, for the ideal space is not defined solely by maps, but by subtle possibilities that escape most people. For months, perhaps years, he studied old maps, cartographic records, and international treaties. He looked at dashed lines and blank areas as if they were silent invitations to imagine a world of his own. Every forgotten corner, every small island or strip of uninhabited land awakened his curiosity and hope. As he observed nautical charts and topographic maps, he wondered whether anyone had ever had the audacity to declare something akin to what he dreamed of. Deep down, there was also a sense of privilege, the perception that he might discover something almost no one else could see. The fascination with free territories, however, is not only geographical. There is a profound psychological component. What he sought was not simply land. It was the materialization of his identity, the physical reflection of an imaginary world that was becoming more vivid in his mind. Each unoccupied space represented the possibility of creating his own rules, of establishing symbols, of transforming imagination itself into reality. It was a delicate blend of desire, strategy, and quiet hope. As he sifted through records and analyzed maps, he began to notice nuances that would go unnoticed by anyone else. A poorly documented borderline, a stretch of desert, or a small island not clearly marked on official maps became potential stages for his empire. There was a ritual to this search: the careful observation, the detailed study of legal texts and historical accounts, the comparison of coordinates, and the evaluation of natural access points. Everything was analyzed with an almost meditative calm, as if each gesture could bring him closer to the realization of his sovereignty. At a certain point, he began to consider the idea that it was not merely the land that defined the empire, but the way he perceived and narrated it. A forgotten piece of land became significant because he believed it so. An uninhabited space turned into a kingdom because someone chose to call it one. This perception, as subtle as it was profound, reveals something about human nature. It is in the attribution of meaning that we find power and identity. The search for a free territory also required discretion. Any sudden move or premature announcement could jeopardize the project, attracting unwanted attention from authorities or the curious. He thus learned to move in silence, to plan each step with patience and delicacy, almost like an artist preparing a work without haste but with total dedication. Each detail, each geographical or legal observation, was recorded and analyzed, forming a mosaic of possibilities that brought him closer to his goal. Naturally, there were also practical challenges. Remote lands often presented natural obstacles: rivers, dense forests, deserts, treacherous seas. The choice of a place depended not only on its legal or symbolic availability, but also on its accessibility, its visibility, and above all, its capacity to be imagined as a habitable space within the empire he was creating in his mind. Every stone, every tree, every bend in a river gained importance, for each contributed to giving shape to a narrative that existed simultaneously on paper and in imagination. Reflecting on this stage, we realize how the search for a free territory is not merely a geographical adventure. It is also an experience of self-discovery. He became aware of his limits, of his patience, of his ability to imagine, to project, and to believe in something that, to everyone else, seemed improbable or impossible. It is a silent reminder that creation requires time, dedication, and the courage to believe in what does not yet exist. The calm and introspection of this process allow the listener to perceive the complexity and delicacy of the task. It is not merely about building an empire. It is about choosing a space that could reflect the uniqueness of an idea, of an identity, and of a silent dream that walks the border between the real and the imagined, between the concrete and the symbolic. In this scenario, every choice was significant. Every study of a map, every analysis of a borderline, every contemplation of a forgotten space brought him closer to a point where fantasy and reality could touch. And it is precisely at this point of intersection that he would begin the next step, the discovery of the perfect place, where his empire could finally manifest itself, even if still in gestation. After months, perhaps years, of silent observation and detailed study, he finally found something that seemed to meet all the criteria he had imagined. It was not a grand territory or one coveted by powerful nations, but it possessed something that made it unique. It was forgotten, marginal, almost invisible to the eyes of the world. A piece of land that lingered on the edges of old maps, outlined by faint and confusing lines, a place that seemed suspended between the real and the imaginary, ready to receive the projection of a solitary dream. The first contact with the site was, naturally, discreet. He did not arrive with proclamations or flags unfurled. He approached quietly, studying every detail of the geography, observing the topography, the trees, the rivers, the stones, and even the direction of the wind. Each element seemed to converse with his imagination, offering subtle clues that this space could become the heart of his empire. There was something almost ritualistic in this process. Calm breathing, attentive gaze, delicate touch upon the soil, as if he were recognizing not only the land, but also the possibility of a place of his own, free to be reinvented. As he walked along the shores and small elevations, he contemplated the symbolic potential of that territory. A forgotten island became a castle, a clearing in the forest turned into a central square, a winding river, cutting through the landscape, became the natural border of his imaginary domain. Each physical detail merged with the narrative that already existed in his mind, creating a world that, though still largely invisible to the outside, gained density with each step, with each silent observation. It was a strange and comforting feeling. There were no witnesses, no critical eyes, only the quiet of the land and the presence of his own thought. In that isolation, he could experience sovereignty in an almost literal way, choosing borders, defining symbols, imagining citizenship and laws, without haste, without interference. It was, in essence, the materialization of his desire for control over a space that reflected the uniqueness of his own identity. The process of discovery, however, was not limited to the physical aspect. He studied historical records, checked old treaties, and analyzed legal documents, seeking to understand whether the territory had ever been disputed, whether there were unresolved claims, or if, by some obscure detail, there might be loopholes that could make his intention plausible. This meticulous analysis reflected a rare awareness that even in almost invisible spaces, the real world left its marks, and any flaw could compromise the legitimacy of his construction. At the same time, there was a poetic dimension to this moment. He realized that the chosen territory was as valuable as it was imaginary, that the concreteness of the space mattered less than the conviction of his own authority. Every stone, every tree, every bend in the river carried meaning not because others recognized it, but because he had decided so. And in that silent act of assigning value, the space became, in truth, imperial. As he contemplated the territory, he reflected on the solitude that accompanies those who create worlds of their own. A one-man empire requires patience and introspection. It demands walking alone along the boundaries of the imaginary and the real, without witnesses or applause. And yet, this solitude was at once liberating, allowing each gesture to be filled with meaning, each decision to be entirely his, without concessions. The fascination of the chosen site also lay in its invisibility. He knew that, to the outside world, it was nothing more than a forgotten, perhaps irrelevant piece of land. But in his mind and in his documents, the space acquired value, status, and history. It became a silent kingdom, a projection of authority that coexisted with reality without direct conflict, allowing fantasy and reality to touch in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. As he remained in that place, he began to mentally structure the first actions of his empire, marking symbolic borders, defining titles and roles, creating documents that could grant legitimacy to what was essentially a creation of his imagination. Every physical detail of the chosen land intertwined with symbols, seals, and carefully crafted texts, as if the very geography were in dialogue with the bureaucracy he had invented. This discovery was not merely geographical, but existential. He experienced the sensation of possessing a territory that reflected his own identity, a space in which his imagination could fully manifest itself, without restrictions. Every step upon the land, every study of maps, every reflection on its possibilities brought him closer to a rare experience. That of being, in fact, sovereign of a world that, though small and almost invisible, was entirely his. The discovery of the chosen place thus marked a crucial point in his journey. It was not merely about occupying a space, but about conferring reality upon what had, until then, existed only on paper and in the mind. Each detail observed and recorded was a silent step toward the realization of his empire, preparing the ground so that, in due time, symbols, documents, and eventually the passport that would almost be accepted could emerge. After carefully choosing the territory, our protagonist felt that the time had come to make his creation something more concrete, something that transcended the limits of paper and silent imagination. It was not merely a physical space he sought to occupy. It was the need to give voice and presence to his own sovereignty. Thus, in a gesture that blended audacity with delicacy, he decided to proclaim the empire that had until then existed only in his mind and in the documents he had so carefully crafted. The proclamation did not take place in a public square, nor before a crowd. It was an introspective act, almost ritualistic, carried out in the solitude of his workspace, surrounded by papers, maps, seals, and writing instruments. Every word he wrote carried weight. Every title bestowed resounded with the solemnity of one who fully believes in the validity of his own creation. It was a silent ceremony, marked by the rhythm of calm breathing and the delicate sound of a pen scratching across paper, transforming ideas into symbolic reality. He composed a central document, a kind of formal declaration of existence, in which his empire was officially proclaimed. Within it, he described the boundaries of the territory, the function of each symbol, the titles he assigned himself, and the laws that, in his vision, would govern his creation. The writing was meticulous, each line carefully constructed to confer legitimacy to something that, in practice, had no recognition from any other country or institution. And yet, to him, each word bore the weight of authority. There was something profoundly poetic in this gesture. The proclamation of the empire did not depend on the gaze of others, nor on the acceptance of witnesses. It existed in and of itself, sustained by the conviction of one who believed in his own world. It is curious to consider that acts of great significance often need no audience. They exist to affirm the identity of the one who performs them, to create meaning where once there was only emptiness. For our protagonist, every line written was a step toward the realization of his dream. Every sentence filled the territory with symbolic authority. In proclaiming his empire, he also established visual symbols. Flags were drawn with carefully chosen colors, shapes, and meanings. Coats of arms emerged, blending elements of tradition with fantasy, granting an aura of history and depth to the creation. He understood that symbols were more than decoration. They were the language of power, capable of conveying authority without the need for confrontation. Every line, every seal, was an instrument of silent persuasion, designed to transform imagination into the perception of legitimacy. One cannot ignore the emotional dimension of this moment. The proclamation of the empire was also an affirmation of freedom. By giving official existence to his imagined territory, he created a parallel reality, a space where his rules, his logic, and his aesthetics overshadowed the limitations of everyday life. This quiet freedom allowed him to perceive himself as the absolute protagonist, not only of his empire but of his own story, of his own identity. At the same time, there was a delicate balance between boldness and introspection. The act of proclaiming the empire was a silent audacity, a gesture that, from the outside, might appear absurd, but that for him carried impeccable inner logic. Each decision was deliberate, each chosen symbol had purpose and meaning, each word written gave substance to what had once been only a concept. And so, the empire began to exist in a tangible way, even if still largely invisible to the outside world. The proclamation also carried with it a sense of continuity. He knew that an empire, even a solitary one, could not be sustained by a single act. It was necessary to create records, documents, symbols, and narratives that could be referenced, remembered, and perhaps, one day, recognized by others. Each detail was documented with patience and care, as though he were building not merely a country, but a history capable of surviving time itself. At this moment, the symbolic and psychological dimensions of the empire became more evident. He did not seek territorial dominion in the traditional sense. He sought confirmation of his own identity, the reflection of his imagination in the physical world. Every decision reinforced the sensation of sovereignty. Every creative act consolidated the idea that his empire existed, even if invisible to others. The proclamation of the empire, though silent, was a decisive milestone. It marked the point where the dream became action, where imagination gained density, and where symbols began to speak for themselves. He saw himself, at last, as sovereign of a space that carried not only geographical borders but also the materialization of a deep desire to create, to affirm, and to exist according to his own rules, in complete harmony with his vision and his quiet patience. And thus, with the act of proclaiming his empire, our protagonist gave concrete form to what had previously existed only in thought, preparing for the next steps, where symbols, documents, and, above all, the passport would become central to his improbable and fascinating story. After the silent proclamation of his empire, our protagonist realized that he needed to give form and consistency to what had emerged from his imagination. An empire, even one belonging to a single person, requires symbols, visible signs that convey authority and legitimacy. It was not enough to declare himself sovereign. It was necessary to build a tangible identity, something that could be recognized, even if only symbolically, by any attentive or curious observer. Thus began the stage of creating titles and symbols of royalty. He started with the titles. Each one carried meaning and invented tradition, a kind of imaginary genealogy that conferred solemnity upon his empire. They were not just words chosen at random. They reflected hierarchy, function, and fabricated history. He assigned himself titles that evoked respect, distinction, and importance, even if they existed nowhere outside his documents. Each title was carefully crafted, imbued with poetry and weight, as if capable of legitimizing his sovereignty on its own. In creating these names, he built a bridge between the real world and fantasy, allowing his empire to exist both on paper and in the mind of its creator. Next came the coats of arms and flags. Each symbol was an exercise in patience and contemplation. He blended traditional elements, crowns, shields, lions, eagles, with his own forms, colors that carried personal meaning, and signs only he fully understood. Every stroke was placed with delicacy. Every chosen hue carried a silent message about the identity of the empire. These symbols did not need official recognition. It was enough that they bore internal coherence and reinforced the conviction of the one who had created them. The flags, for instance, were more than pieces of imaginary cloth. They were visual representations of authority, capable of transforming the space where they were imagined to fly. He envisioned the banners waving on invisible masts, overlooking the landscape of the chosen territory. Every detail of the design was intended to create impact, to transmit seriousness, and even a certain solemnity, despite the improvised and silent nature of his creation. The coat of arms, meanwhile, served as the empire's signature, a symbol that carried within it the essence of his invention and that, in time, would be stamped onto documents, proclamations, and eventually, the passport that almost achieved recognition. There was also the question of colors. He reflected on the meaning of each shade, on the feelings they might evoke in anyone who happened to see the symbols. Deep blue suggested calm and stability, red, courage and energy, gold, prestige and solemnity. Each combination was carefully calculated to create a visual harmony that reinforced the idea of a dignified empire, even if invisible to the outside world. His attention to detail revealed not only creativity, but a profound respect for his own ideas, as though every color and every line were vital to giving consistency to the sovereignty he sought to affirm. Moreover, the titles and symbols allowed fantasy to take on ritual. He could write proclamations, stamp documents, assign roles, and stage imaginary ceremonies, each marked by his symbols and colors, each act steeped in silent solemnity. It was a way of inhabiting the empire, of living his sovereignty in a concrete manner, even if invisible to others. And in doing so, he discovered something curious. The sensation of power and belonging did not depend on external recognition. It was enough to believe and to maintain coherence between symbols, titles, and narrative. These symbols also offered a way to communicate with the world, even if subtly. A coat of arms or a flag, when shown to a curious onlooker or placed upon a document, carried authority. He understood that the strength of a symbol does not lie in its material form, but in the belief others may place in it, or in the conviction with which it is presented. Every element created, every invented title, was a small bridge between imagination and reality, a quiet way of testing how deeply human convention depends on perception and collective belief. As you breathe slowly, imagine the patience and silent attention with which he carried out each drawing, each title, each coat of arms. There was no hurry, no audience, only the calm contemplation of someone building a reality of their own, step by step, with quiet dedication. Every gesture reinforced the empire's sense of existence and allowed the dream, once invisible, to manifest through concrete symbols, even if not yet officially recognized. The work of creating titles and symbols consolidated the empire on another level. It was no longer just an idea. It had become a symbolic reality, structured, tangible within his imagination and in documents that could be seen, admired, and even questioned. This care, this attention to detail, demonstrated that his empire existed fully in the realm of conviction, and that symbolic creation could be as powerful as the physical occupation of land. Thus, upon completing the titles, coats of arms and flags, our protagonist reached a new dimension, the materialization of imaginary power, proof that even a solitary individual could raise an empire, endow it with history, identity, and symbols, and prepare the way for the next steps, where documents, records, and the emblematic passport would become central pieces of his daring creation. With his silent empire structured, titles assigned, coats of arms drawn, and flags imagined, our protagonist felt it was time to take a step that would cross the boundary between fantasy and reality: the creation of a passport. A document that could symbolize the existence of his empire, making concrete what until then had lived only in his mind, on papers, and in drawings. It was not an official document recognized by governments, but something capable of carrying symbolic legitimacy, an artifact that reflected all the care and conviction invested in his creation. The passport began to take shape in his mind even before it was drawn. He pondered over every detail: the size of the document, the type of paper, the layout of the pages, the seals that would give it an air of authenticity. Each element needed to convey seriousness and solemnity, granting the bearer, himself of course, the sense of possessing rights and a distinct identity, even if only within the sphere of his imagined empire. There was also an aesthetic concern. The passport needed to be beautiful, elegant, inviting to silent contemplation, capable of provoking a quiet admiration even in a casual observer. As he put his ideas on paper, he drew coats of arms, repeated colors and symbols already used in the empire's flags and official documents. Each seal was carefully designed, as if it had the power to authenticate the existence of the territory and the sovereignty of its creator. He understood that a passport was, above all, a visual proof, and that coherence between symbols and colors would be essential for the document to carry any symbolic weight. Every line, every emblem, was the product of patience and attention, almost like a meditation in which ink and paper became instruments of personal affirmation. At the same time, there was a fascinating psychological dimension to this act. Creating a passport for a one-man empire required courage and conviction, for everyone knew, at least rationally, that no country would recognize such a document. And yet, he pressed forward, immersed in the silent calm of his routine, certain that the strength of the passport did not lie in external recognition, but in the solidity of his own belief. The passport was, in essence, an extension of his symbolic empire, proof that something invented could acquire density and meaning. The elaboration process also included the choice of fictional personal information. He wrote his own name with grandeur, added imaginary dates and numbers that seemed official, composing a record consistent with the universe he had created. Every detail reinforced the passport's internal authenticity, while playing with the idea that documents are not merely papers, but instruments of collective conviction, or at least of individual conviction. When the passport finally took physical form, even if in modest dimensions, he looked at it with a mixture of pride and contemplation. It was something that condensed all the silent effort, months of observation, the study of maps, the creation of titles, coats of arms, and flags. The document seemed to carry not only the existence of a marginal territory, but the very identity of its creator, symbolizing the entire empire within carefully designed pages. But there was a fascinating detail in this story. The passport, despite its unlikely origin, nearly managed to cross boundaries no one would have imagined. In certain situations, when presented in specific contexts, it stirred curiosity, attention, and even confusion. The way the symbols were drawn, the implicit solemnity in every seal, the internal coherence of the document. All this provoked subtle reactions that almost allowed it to be accepted, if only temporarily, by those assessing its legitimacy without deep scrutiny. This almost reveals something about the fragility of human conventions. A well-presented document, even from an invented empire, can at first glance appear plausible. As you breathe slowly, imagine the silent dedication, the meticulous patience, and the introspection this process required. The passport was more than a piece of paper. It was the materialization of convictions, a bridge between imagination and the physical world, a symbol of the human ability to transform ideas into tangible experiences. It carried within it the essence of the empire, consolidating, in a concrete form, the sovereignty of a man over a kingdom that existed, above all, in the mind and in the quiet care with which every detail had been conceived. And so, the unusual passport became one of the central elements of his improbable story, the ultimate symbol of a one-man empire, bearing within it the beauty and strangeness of a gesture that blends imagination, patience, determination, and the courage to turn dreams into reality, even if in a singular and silent way. After the meticulous elaboration of the passport, our protagonist felt a mixture of expectation and serenity. It was a document that synthesized months of patience, attention to detail, and silent conviction. Every seal, every coat of arms, every title printed on its pages carried the symbolic authority of a one-man empire. But now something crucial remained: to discover whether that which existed only in papers and imagination could, in some way, interact with the real world. The passport needed a test, even a simple one, a silent, almost intimate verification that would put its plausibility to the test. The first test did not take place in airports or official border crossings. It began discreetly, in everyday interactions, like a kind of experimental exercise. He showed the passport to trusted people, observing their reactions, the contained curiosity in quick glances, the hesitation in accepting what seemed strange. Each observation offered clues about the symbolic strength of the document. Surprisingly, many reacted with genuine interest, without probing too deeply into its authenticity. The careful use of symbols, colors, and seals created an impression of seriousness that almost turned fantasy into reality. It was fascinating to realize how the world often accepts visual and formal conventions without questioning their origins in detail. A document that, rationally, should have had no validity, began to generate curiosity and even respect. The passport functioned as a subtle bridge between imagination and external perception. Each stamped seal, each drawn signature contributed to building an internal coherence that, even unknown to the public, seemed plausible. Human perception, in this context, is malleable, and the creator's conviction seemed enough to suggest legitimacy. The protagonist, still immersed in introspection, reflected on the nature of authority. A piece of paper, adorned with well-drawn symbols and carefully chosen words, could communicate sovereignty, recognition, and belonging, even if no official government agreed. This understanding reinforced the poetic dimension of his creation, an empire that existed both in imagination and in the physical world, validated not by external laws, but by the care and attention devoted to every detail. In a second test, he ventured into more formal interactions. In situations that required identification, he presented the passport naturally, without fuss, letting the details speak for themselves. Its coherent appearance, organized aesthetics, and the implicit solemnity of its symbols sparked curiosity and, at times, temporary acceptance. It was almost surreal, an invented document managing to slip past the critical gaze of the world, if only for brief and subtle moments. This quiet experience reinforced the complexity of his creation, showing that, at times, form and presentation can outweigh officially recognized substance. Observing these reactions, he learned something important about perception and trust. Credibility does not depend solely on objective reality, but also on presentation and internal consistency. The passport functioned as a metaphor. A one-man empire could exist because all its elements, territory, symbols, titles, and documents, were coherent with one another. This coherence conferred authenticity, even if it was an invented authenticity, perceived more in the imagination of others than in official rules. The process also revealed a profound emotional aspect. Every partial acceptance of the passport, every curious glance, reinforced the sense that his effort had not been in vain. It was the quiet validation that creativity, patience, and conviction could generate tangible effects in the world, even when external reality seemed unyielding. This almost magical experience of near acceptance transformed the solitude of his empire into something interactive, as though the world, for fleeting instants, acknowledged the existence of his silent sovereignty. The first test showed that, although the empire was that of a single person, it could communicate with the outside world. The passport functioned as a mediator, as a tangible symbol of imaginary authority, capable of provoking reflection, curiosity, and even temporary acceptance. He realized he had created something that transcended paper and ink, something that interacted with human perception, carrying within it the complexity and delicacy of its conception. At the end of this first test, the protagonist felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. It was not merely the creation of a document, but the confirmation that patience, attention, and imagination could indeed generate concrete experiences, even when they defied the usual logic of the world. The unusual passport was not just a piece of paper. It was the tangible proof of an empire, an identity, and a dream carefully cultivated, now ready for the next challenges, in which its almost surprising validity would be tested in even more unexpected ways. After the first test, our protagonist realized that the passport was not merely a silent document, but also a catalyst for unexpected reactions. Each time he presented it, even in discrete situations, curious looks appeared, expressions of surprise, and sometimes a brief acknowledgement of the solemnity it carried. It didn't matter whether the observer understood the full scope of the gesture or questioned its validity. There was something in the visual and symbolic coherence of the document that drew attention and sparked interest. The experience gradually became a kind of introspective and social ritual at the same time. He observed the reactions of others calmly, almost meditatively, trying to understand which elements evoked respect, curiosity, or disbelief. Every detail of the passport, from the carefully drawn seals to the coats of arms and colors, seemed to possess a quiet strength, capable of transcending ordinary logic and evoking a sense of legitimacy. It was curious to see how human perception could be guided by symbols and consistency, even when the content was, technically, fictitious. On some occasions, the surprises were subtle: a restrained smile, a prolonged glance at a specific page, a barely audible remark about the originality of the document. On others, the reaction bordered on the unbelievable: questions about the real existence of the empire, small attempts to validate what was, in truth, a solitary creation. He observed it all with introspection, absorbing every gesture and analyzing how the perception of others responded to what had been conceived with patience and quiet care. Naturally, there were also moments of disbelief or skepticism. Some reacted with astonishment, others with discreet laughter or suspicious comments. Yet, even in those cases, the passport's power as a symbolic object remained intact. He learned that the effectiveness of his creation did not depend on unanimous recognition, but rather on its internal consistency and the care devoted to every detail. The passport worked as a bridge between imagination and reality, where the power of symbol and narrative outweighed official approval. As he contemplated these reactions, he reflected on the nature of authority and social acceptance. A document could exist legitimately within a symbolic universe, even if ignored or questioned by the outside world. The passport was, in this sense, a silent experiment on how human perception interacts with signs of power, identity, and coherence. He noticed that when visual, textual, and symbolic elements converge harmoniously, it is possible to create something that, though fictional, has real impact and evokes genuine curiosity. The surprises were not limited to the observers. There was also an internal effect on the creator himself. Each partial acceptance, each curious look, reinforced his conviction, giving meaning to the solitude of his empire and showing that months of study, drawing, and symbolic elaboration had not been in vain. It was a quiet confirmation that creativity, patience, and attention to detail can generate concrete experiences, even when they seem improbable. Over time, he began to carefully record these reactions. He observed the impact of each seal, each coat of arms, each written line, as if he could learn from every human response what conferred credibility and solemnity to the passport. This constant observation was silent, introspective, almost meditative. It allowed for subtle adjustments, refinements that made the document even more coherent and convincing, without ever losing the solitary and contemplative essence of its creation. The symbolic dimension of the passport grew stronger with each surprise. He did not need formal recognition to feel the existence of his empire. It was enough to notice that his choices, his aesthetics, and his patience provoked curiosity and attention. Each external gesture of acceptance, however small, worked as a silent validation, proof that even in a skeptical world, it is possible to create meaning and authority through consistency, attentiveness, and imagination. The protagonist also began to perceive the paradoxical beauty of the situation. A one-person empire, almost entirely invisible to the world, could produce concrete effects simply by existing symbolically. The passport thus became not only a document but also a mediator between fantasy and reality, between solitude and interaction, between creation and perception. Each human reaction, from quiet interest to the most skeptical questioning, enriched his understanding of the complexity and power of an inventive gesture, however improbable. Ultimately, the surprises and reactions to the passport revealed something profound about human nature and the world we live in. Even small gestures, carefully crafted and laden with symbolic meaning, can have real impact. Each curious glance or silent remark reinforced the existence of the empire and the identity of its creator, showing that patience, attention to detail, and quiet conviction can transform solitary ideas into tangible, almost magical experiences, even if not officially recognized. After observing the initial reactions and surprises to the passport, our protagonist began to contemplate an even more delicate challenge: the possibility of interacting with formal authorities, those who define the boundaries of what is recognized or not by the world. It was not a matter of seeking complete validation, but of testing, in a measured way, how far his creation could be perceived as plausible. Each step in this process required patience, introspection, and an almost meditative sensitivity. He carefully studied procedures, analyzed routines and protocols, imagining how he could present his passport without causing immediate shock or exaggerated disbelief. Every detail mattered: the approach, the tone of voice, the precise moment to show the document. It was an exercise in quiet patience, where the one-person empire needed to operate at the edges of reality, without noise, without rush, without anticipating the authorities' ultimate reaction. The initial approach was discreet. He did not seek public attention or dramatization. It was an almost intimate interaction, a testing experience. When approaching officials, he presented his passport naturally, allowing the symbols, colors, and seals to speak for themselves. He observed each gesture, each pause, each glance, absorbing information about how his creation was perceived. Silence, in this context, acted as an ally. No one interrupted, no one questioned immediately. There was only careful observation and contained curiosity. There was also a deep element of introspection. By placing himself in this position, he reflected on the nature of official recognition, on what truly grants legitimacy to a document, a territory, or a title. He realized that human authority is often guided more by external signs, colors, seals, visual coherence, than by detailed verifications or profound questioning. This perception strengthened the silent strategy he had been employing from the start, building symbolic consistency and density, creating an impression of seriousness that transcended objective reality. The first contact with authorities brought small surprises. Some officials hesitated, examining the document carefully, mentally questioning its plausibility, but rarely expressed outright disbelief. Others reacted with contained curiosity, as if it were impossible not to notice the visual coherence of the passport and the solemnity implied in each seal. These silent interactions reinforced the protagonist's perception. His creation carried symbolic weight, even if temporary, even if only partially recognized, and every detail mattered. At times, small lapses in the attention or perception of the authorities revealed how much symbol and presentation can surpass substance. The passport, though unofficial, functioned as a bridge between imagination and reality, capable of generating almost concrete effects merely by the way it was displayed. This silent discovery solidified the idea that the one-person empire existed not only in territory and documents but also in the perception of others, even if partial or temporary. The process also demanded a delicate balance between audacity and caution. Every movement had to be calculated. Any abrupt gesture could collapse the carefully constructed plausibility. He walked the fine line between the assertiveness necessary for his empire to be perceived and the moderation required to avoid immediate disbelief. This silent practice became almost meditative, each step an exercise in patience, introspection, and attention to detail, as if calibrating others' perceptions so that fantasy could approach reality. Over time, he began to notice patterns in the reactions: pauses, lingering glances, slight curiosity. Each observation was recorded mentally, each detail analyzed, as if refining a laboratory experiment where the main variable was human perception. Approaching authority did not yield full formal recognition, but it allowed him to test the limits of what was acceptable and plausible. It was a silent dance between imagination, symbols, and human behavior. The protagonist also reflected on the poetic dimension of this experience. A one-person empire, created with patience and attention, could cross formal barriers partially, provoking surprise and questioning, but also implicit acknowledgement. The strength of his creation lay not only in the territory or the passport, but in its internal consistency and the ability to interact with the world in a subtle, silent, and controlled manner. Thus, each step in this approach revealed something about the nature of power, perception, and legitimacy. Even an apparently improbable creation, if structured with care and coherence, can produce tangible and surprising effects. The one-person empire advanced silently, sustained by patience, creativity, and attention to detail, ready to face the next challenges and perhaps gain recognition, even if temporary and partial, from a world that did not expect to encounter sovereignty in an unlikely document. Although his passport had sparked surprise and curiosity, our protagonist knew that the path of symbolic sovereignty would inevitably encounter obstacles: the complexity of law and bureaucracy. A one-person empire, no matter how elaborately constructed with symbols, titles, and documents, existed in silent tension with the rules and systems imposed by the real world. This awareness did not cause discouragement. On the contrary, it strengthened his focus and introspection, as each challenge offered an opportunity to explore the boundary between imagination and reality. The first obstacles appeared subtly. Authorities, officials, or any formal body involved in document verification had strict protocols. Official documents required records, records demanded validation, and validation depended on institutions that did not recognize the imaginary empire. The protagonist observed every rule, every requirement, with almost meditative patience, understanding that bureaucracy functioned as its own territory, full of invisible boundaries and subtle logic. Each difficulty provoked reflection. He understood that while symbols and titles could create a sense of legitimacy, the real world had control mechanisms that could not be ignored. It was a silent dance between invention and reality. He needed to adjust details, reinterpret documents, understand codes and patterns, and anticipate the reactions of officials, all without losing the serenity that had marked his approach from the beginning. Some attempts at official recognition, small interactions with officials, sending documents, or requesting symbolic acknowledgement, met immediate resistance. Incomplete forms, missing stamps, unfinished protocols. Each barrier revealed that the official world operates according to rigid rules, often impervious to imagination. Yet, frustration was contained. The protagonist accepted each obstacle with quiet patience, observing nuances and learning from every detail. There was also a strategic dimension to this process. Each bureaucratic challenge was carefully analyzed. Where progress might be possible, where symbolic adjustments could have an impact, and how each human reaction could be understood and anticipated. He realized that bureaucracy often values not only objective truth but also coherence, clarity, and formality. The passport, meticulously designed with seals, colors, and titles, demonstrated attention to formal details, and this precision almost compensated for the lack of official recognition. Facing bureaucracy also allowed him to explore the silent resilience of his one-person empire. He learned to persist without fanfare, to record each response, and to interpret subtle glances and gestures from officials. Each frustrated attempt was not an absolute failure but a data point to be incorporated, a refinement that strengthened the document, the symbolic territory, and his understanding of the project. Patience, in this context, was both a tool and a philosophy. At the same time, the protagonist reflected on the nature of rules and authority. Official documents, laws, and regulations exist to create order but also function as filters that limit possibilities. The symbolic empire, even in its formal invisibility, positioned itself as a silent experiment on the limits of these structures. Each bureaucratic challenge was an opportunity to understand how symbols, consistency, and conviction interact with formal systems, and to explore how human perception can be influenced by a carefully constructed narrative. The process, though silent and introspective, contained moments of tension. The empire existed at the intersection of imagination and reality, and each bureaucratic obstacle reminded him that fantasy, no matter how solid, faces external limits. Yet he advanced with care and attention, refining the passport, adjusting titles and seals, and observing how each change affected the perception of those he encountered. Every detail mattered, and patient attention created an almost meditative relationship with bureaucracy, transforming challenges into quiet learning. By the end of this stage, he understood that legal and bureaucratic challenges were not merely barriers. They were a mirror of the complexity of the real world, testing his patience, creativity, and ability to maintain internal coherence. The empire continued to exist, even if invisible to the official world, and each obstacle reinforced the symbolic strength of his creation. He moved forward, silent, observant, and persistent, ready for the next steps, where the almost miraculous acceptance of his passport would become one of the most fascinating stories of his solitary empire. After weeks of silent testing and meticulous interactions with authorities and officials, a small surprise began to emerge. The possibility that his passport, improbable and carefully crafted, might be accepted partially. It was not a full official recognition, but a gesture that, even if minimal, validated the symbolic existence of his empire. This first partial approval occurred almost unexpectedly. In a subtle and quiet moment, capable of transforming months of effort into a tangible experience. The episode took place in a routine situation when the passport was briefly examined by someone who, even attentive to rules and regulations, allowed the document to pass without immediate objection. The protagonist observed every gesture, every pause, every detail of the interaction, absorbing the experience mentally as if it were a meditative ritual. It was fascinating to realize that the internal coherence of the passport, the seals, colors, titles, and symbols, generated enough credibility to create partial, even if temporary, acceptance. This approval brought a unique sensation. For the solitary creator of a one-person empire, the gesture of recognition, however small, functioned as a bridge between fantasy and the real world. It was proof that patience, attention to detail, and consistency could produce tangible effects. Every stamped seal, every carefully drawn coat of arms, every title aligned with the empire's symbols contributed to creating an impression of legitimacy that, for a moment, convinced a formal observer of the document's plausibility. There was also a dimension of deep introspection. He reflected on the nature of power and authority. How curious it is that a document, technically fictitious, can cross the perception of rigid systems and formal rules solely through visual and symbolic coherence. Each human reaction acted as a silent mirror, reflecting both the strength of his creation and the fragilities of the institutional world. It was a reminder that authority is often perceived as much through appearance as through substance, and that well-constructed symbols can provoke acceptance even when formal reality proves resistant. The protagonist observed the effect of the passport not only on others but also on himself. Each partial acceptance reinforced his confidence and consolidated the sense of his empire's existence. It was as if a tiny silent gesture validated months of work, the creation of titles, coats of arms, flags, documents, and symbols that transformed imagination into something almost tangible. The partial approval was discreet but deeply significant, indicating that his dedication had not been in vain. Furthermore, this partial recognition allowed him to explore even subtler nuances of bureaucracy and human perception. He began to observe which elements of the passport generated the most trust, which details went unnoticed, and which provoked momentary doubts. Each interaction became a silent lesson on persuasion, perception, and the power of symbols. It was a continuous learning process, in which patience and observation replaced any attempt at forceful imposition or persuasion. The experience also revealed something curious about limits and possibilities. Although the passport was not officially recognized, its partial acceptance showed that small gaps exist within rigid systems, and that a consistent project, even an improbable one, can cross invisible boundaries. This realization reinforced the idea that symbolic solidity and internal coherence can sometimes surpass the formal rigidity of the real world. As you breathe slowly, imagine the calm and serenity with which the protagonist absorbed every detail of this approval. Nothing was rushed, every gesture was recorded mentally, every reaction analyzed. The one-person empire thus became more solid and real, not only in papers and symbols but also in the silent perception of those who, for brief moments, believed in its existence. And so, the first partial approval of the passport became a quiet and introspective milestone. It was proof that patience, creativity, and attention to detail can generate tangible results, even when working alone in imaginary territory. The empire advanced, invisible to most, yet already capable of provoking recognition and surprise, paving the way for even more astonishing stages of his improbable and fascinating story. After the first partial approval of the passport, the one-person empire began to interact with the outside world in even more curious ways. Unexpected reactions and small confusions emerged, silent and subtle, like delicate ripples across the surface of a lake. It was remarkable to observe how something created with patience, introspection, and attention to detail could provoke effects entirely beyond the creator's control. Each interaction generated a sense of wonder and strangeness, mixed with a certain contemplative lightness. Some cases were almost comical. Officials hesitated, consulted colleagues, and repeated simple questions, as if trying to confirm the plausibility of a document that, rationally, could not exist. The protagonist calmly observed each gesture, absorbing the silence of pauses, the lingering glances, and the cautious responses. Each reaction functioned as a living experiment, demonstrating the extent to which human perception can be guided by symbols, coherence, and solemnity, even when faced with something improbable. There were also subtler and more complex confusions. People accepted the passport partially, only to question it afterward, or treated it as a curiosity with no real value. Some tried to cross-check information with official systems, creating small misunderstandings and occasionally provoking restrained laughter or quiet comments among observers. For the protagonist, these situations were not a cause for frustration but an invitation to contemplation. Each confusion revealed nuances of perception and interpretation, and every unexpected reaction served as a silent window into the human mind. The cumulative effect of these unexpected reactions was fascinating. The passport, though fictitious, began to have a tangible presence, not only as an object but as a living narrative, capable of generating small stories around it. Unknown people interacted with it, reacted, commented, and, even without realizing it, contributed to the symbolic construction of the empire. It was as if the protagonist's imagination had quietly spread, silently touching reality through the perceptions of others. At the same time, reflections arose on limits and plausibility. He understood that, although he could create internal coherence and symbolic density, the real world has rules and expectations that cannot be entirely ignored. Each confusion and unexpected reaction offered lessons on how to balance fantasy with signals of plausibility, how to adjust titles, coats of arms, or seals, and how to deal with minor inconsistencies perceived by others. It was a practice of silent patience, where every detail mattered, and every observation was absorbed with contemplative attention. Some reactions even sparked genuine curiosity, with unexpected questions about the origin of the empire, its history, or the validity of the passport. The protagonist responded calmly, allowing his words to remain brief and contemplative, without haste or any need to persuade. The effect was that, even in its singularity, his empire seemed to have presence and importance, albeit partial, in the eyes of those observing it. Each interaction, each minor confusion, reinforced the complexity and symbolic density of his creation. It was fascinating to see how unexpected reactions also reflected the relationship between perception and reality. People reacted not only to the passport itself but to the creator's gesture, the solemnity of the symbols, and the coherence of the narrative. It was a reminder that authority and legitimacy are often felt more than proven, and that minor inconsistencies can be absorbed when presentation and quiet care are sufficient to generate an impression of seriousness. As you breathe slowly, imagine the protagonist contemplating every detail of these interactions, silently observing reactions, and mentally recording every hesitation, gesture, and comment. He transformed confusion and surprise into learning, patience, and attention, further consolidating his symbolic empire. Each unexpected reaction became part of the story, enriching the narrative of the passport and the empire, making them more alive and real within their own silent sphere. And so, amidst unexpected reactions and small confusions, the one-person empire advanced in complexity, revealing that even in the absence of formal recognition, patience, attention to detail, and internal coherence can create tangible, mysterious, and fascinating effects, capable of silently surprising and delighting those who come into contact with this improbable story. After observing unexpected reactions and minor confusions, our protagonist realized that his passport, as carefully crafted as it was, could still be improved. Every interaction with authorities, every observation of curious onlookers, and every silent hesitation revealed subtle details that could be adjusted. Thus began a phase of introspective and quiet refinement, in which patience and attention to the smallest details became essential tools for solidifying the one-person empire. The adjustments began with minor visual changes. He reviewed colors, seals, coats of arms, and titles, seeking absolute coherence and aesthetic harmony. Every detail was designed to convey even more solemnity and legitimacy, without ever losing the imaginative character that defined his creation. Lines were redrawn, emblems adjusted, proportions recalibrated. Nothing was done hastily. Each gesture was contemplative, almost meditative, reflecting the profound connection between creator and empire. Beyond aesthetics, he paid attention to the structure of the document. The pages were organized to guide the observer intuitively, facilitating reading and increasing the sense of plausibility. Each section, each seal, each annotation seemed to follow a silent script, as if the passport told, page by page, the story of the empire and its sole sovereign. This internal coherence enhanced credibility, allowing more attentive observers to perceive consistency and solemnity, even without knowing the entirety of the invention. Adjustments also included revising texts and descriptions within the passport. Titles and functions were refined to convey clarity and importance, without exaggerations that could trigger immediate disbelief. He sought a delicate balance, maintaining symbolic grandeur while avoiding any sign that might reveal the solitary and imaginative origin of the empire. Every word, every sentence, was chosen with care, almost like notes in a silent melody harmonizing form and meaning. Another dimension of the refinements involved seals and stamps. He realized that small variations in detail, the position of a seal, the shade of a color, or the thickness of a line, could alter the perception of credibility. Thus, he spent hours calmly and patiently adjusting each element, as if sculpting something both ephemeral and eternal at the same time. Every change increased the sense of symbolic realism, bringing his imaginary empire even closer to a perception of external plausibility. Beyond form, he also considered the psychological impact of the passport. He observed how attention to detail influenced reactions, how consistent symbols and clear texts generated quiet respect and curiosity. Each refinement was tested in discrete interactions, allowing for small corrections, language adjustments, and visual changes, always maintaining the introspective and contemplative tone that defined his approach. The refinement phase also strengthened the protagonist's relationship with his own empire. He discovered that care for details, patience, and quiet attention generated a deep sense of belonging and authority, even in a world that did not formally recognize his creation. The passport became not merely a document, but a meditative extension of the empire, capable of consolidating the symbolic identity of the solitary sovereign. As you breathe slowly, imagine the calm and focus with which he reviewed each detail, adjusted colors, repositioned seals, and refined texts. Every gesture was an act of silent care, a meditation on consistency, plausibility, and perception. The passport transformed, page by page, seal by seal, into a living work, rich with meaning and capable of generating impact, even in the absence of formal recognition. And so, the adjustments and refinements in the passport not only increased its plausibility but also strengthened the very experience of creation. The one-person empire advanced silently, structured, introspective, and almost tangible, ready to face the next challenges and surprises, where each carefully worked detail could become the key to acceptance, recognition, and influence in the outside world. With the adjustments and refinements completed, the passport began to reveal its silent impact in a more perceptible way. It was not a loud, visible transformation, evident to everyone, but rather delicate and subtle effects, almost imperceptible to those not paying close attention. With each presentation, each quiet interaction, it was as if the document emanated a discrete presence, capable of arousing curiosity, attention, and, at times, a nearly magical sense of legitimacy. The impact first manifested in lingering glances and subtle hesitations. Officials examining the passport for brief moments displayed quiet care, a contained curiosity indicating tacit recognition. Even without offering any formal approval, they interacted with the document in a manner suggesting respect for its coherence and attention to detail. Each seal, each coat of arms, each carefully drawn title conveyed a sense of solemnity that could not be ignored. It was fascinating to observe how well-structured and consistent symbols could influence human perception. The passport functioned as an extension of the one-person empire, translating months of patience and introspection into visual signals imbued with meaning. The protagonist realized that his creation, though invisible to most, was beginning to interact with the world in an almost tangible way, generating impact not through force or imposition, but through coherence, aesthetics, and quiet conviction. Some interactions produced small, unexpected effects. People discreetly commented on the originality of the document, asked brief questions, or hesitated before returning it. In certain cases, the passport prompted internal reflections in observers, as if the symbolic consistency and solemnity created a sense of plausibility, even when rationally everyone knew it was an invented document. The silent impact was therefore both psychological and social, influencing impressions, thoughts, and small behaviors of those who encountered it. Moreover, the effect of the passport extended beyond immediate interactions. Those who accessed the document shared their curiosity with others, discreetly commenting on its uniqueness. This silent propagation increased the symbolic presence of the empire, as if the attention and perception of others contributed to expanding the influence of something that, officially, did not exist. Each observation, each comment, became a silent link connecting the protagonist's creation to the external world, strengthening the symbolic territory almost invisibly. The impact also had an internal effect. The protagonist, noticing the attention and curiosity his passport evoked, felt an introspective validation. It was the quiet confirmation that patience, attention, and care can produce tangible experiences, even if not formally recognized. Each seal, each coat of arms, each title consolidated not only the plausibility of the document, but also the symbolic identity of his empire. The sense of achievement was serene, almost meditative, immersed in contemplation of his own creation. He also reflected on the nature of human perception and symbolic authority. The passport demonstrated that often, form, coherence, and consistency can create a greater impact than objective verification. Attention to detail, patience, and the aesthetic of the document generated an aura of legitimacy that functioned independently of official recognition. It was a reminder that human perception is malleable, and that authority often manifests through subtle, well-structured signals. As you breathe slowly, imagine the tranquility with which the protagonist observed each silent reaction, each hesitation, each brief comment. Each interaction consolidated the empire within its symbolic sphere, strengthening the sense of existence and power of a territory created with patience and care. The passport, in its subtlety, became an instrument of contemplation, impact, and presence, almost like a living work of art interacting with the world quietly. And so, the silent impact of the passport revealed the beauty of his creation, a one-person empire, invisible to most, yet capable of producing tangible effects through symbols, coherence, and conviction. It was proof that patience, introspection, and attention to detail can transform imagination into a tangible experience, creating a discrete, mysterious, and fascinating presence in the external world. After months of silent testing, refinements, and careful observation, our protagonist decided to face a bolder challenge, seeking some level of formal recognition for his passport and, consequently, for his one-person empire. It was not an exercise in excessive ambition, but a meticulous, introspective, almost meditative experiment to see how far his creation could be perceived as plausible within official systems. Preparation for this attempt was thorough. Every detail of the passport was reviewed again, titles adjusted, coats of arms verified, seals calibrated, and colors harmonized. Nothing was done hastily. Each change resulted from quiet reflection on perception, coherence, and aesthetics. He knew that even if the attempt failed, the experience would be valuable, providing insights into limits, human reactions, and formal bureaucracy. Approaching the authorities, the protagonist adopted a serene and confident posture, without haste or the need to prove anything emphatically. He presented the passport naturally, letting the symbolic elements speak for themselves. Every gesture, pause, and detail of the interaction was observed with care, almost like a silent experiment in which the external world served as a mirror to measure the impact of his creation. The initial reactions were discreet but notable. Officials examined the passport carefully, commenting in a contained manner and showing curiosity. Some hesitated before returning the document, others asked small questions about its origin. Nothing indicated full formal acceptance, Yet the seriousness with which the passport was treated suggested tacit recognition, however partial. It was fascinating to see how coherence, attention to detail, and visual presentation could create an impact within rigid and formal structures. There were, of course, moments of doubt and disbelief. Authorities questioned norms, analyzed records, and searched for inconsistencies. The protagonist, still silent and introspective, did not despair. Every observation was absorbed, every reaction recorded mentally. He understood that seeking formal recognition would always be limited, yet even small signs of partial acceptance offered a quiet validation of his creation. Each hesitation, prolonged glance, and contained comment contributed to consolidating the experience and strengthening the perception of his empire's existence. This attempt also revealed subtle aspects of bureaucracy and human perception. He realized that official systems often value coherence, consistency, and presentation more than the factual origin of a document. The passport, with its refined aesthetics, well-structured titles, and detailed seals, managed to create an impression of legitimacy that transcended formal logic. It was almost as if the creator's care and attention were intuitively recognized, allowing the document to cross invisible barriers of plausibility. At the same time, a silent psychological effect emerged. Each interaction with authorities reinforced the protagonist's confidence in his creation and in the symbolic power of his empire. The experience was introspective, meditative, a form of practical contemplation in which every gesture, detail, and reaction was absorbed with quiet attention. The attempt at formal recognition functioned not only as a test of the passport's plausibility but also of the ability to create something that interacts with the world in a subtle, almost magical way. There was also the awareness that every small partial acceptance, every contained reaction, constituted a symbolic territory within bureaucracy. The empire, though invisible to most, found space to manifest through the perception, attention, and quiet respect of those who encountered it. Each detail of the passport reinforced internal coherence, creating an almost tangible experience of sovereignty and authority, even if only symbolic. As you breathe slowly, imagine the serenity and concentration with which the protagonist observed every gesture, pause, and comment. The attempt at formal recognition was not about victory or defeat, but about measuring the extent of human perception and the power of carefully constructed symbols. Every silent interaction consolidated the one-person empire, demonstrating that patience, creativity, and attention to detail can generate tangible, albeit subtle, effects within rigid, formal systems. And so, the attempt at formal recognition revealed the complexity and beauty of the creation. A solitary empire that, through a meticulously crafted passport, managed to touch the outside world delicately, introspectively, and fascinatingly, showing that plausibility, coherence, and symbolism can cross invisible barriers and generate impact even without full approval. After months of silent patience, testing, refinements, and almost meditative interactions with authorities and observers, an unexpected moment arrived. A surprising acceptance. It was neither complete nor official in the strict sense, but there was something in the gesture, discreet, almost imperceptible, that conferred a level of recognition to the passport and the one-person empire that no one could have predicted. This moment transformed the quiet narrative of creation into a tangible, almost magical experience, as if months of work had finally found an echo in the outside world. The acceptance occurred during a routine moment, when the passport was examined carefully by someone who, in principle, should have adhered strictly to formal norms. Yet the visual consistency, attention to detail, and symbolic coherence of the document elicited a subtle reaction. Prolonged glances, meditative pauses, small discreet questions. The gesture, though minimal, conveyed more than any official stamp ever could. It was confirmation that an empire built with patience and introspection could provoke recognition, even if partial, in the real world. The protagonist absorbed every detail of the interaction calmly. Each hesitation, each almost inaudible comment, Each silent examination of the document acted as a sign of validation. It was not a boisterous triumph or external celebration. It was a serene, contained acceptance capable of reinforcing the sense of existence and authority of his empire. This delicate and introspective experience demonstrated how symbols, coherence, and attention to detail can create a perceptible impact, even in contexts that seem impermeable to imagination. The reactions of those interacting with the passport were fascinating to observe. Some showed restrained surprise, others hesitated, consulted colleagues, or mentally analyzed the plausibility of the document. There was also a quiet, almost meditative curiosity that allowed the protagonist to perceive the effect of every detail. The color of a seal, the precision of a coat of arms, the arrangement of titles, all functioning as elements of a narrative that generated impact without fanfare. The surprising acceptance was thus the result not only of the passport's appearance but of a meticulous symbolic construction, born of patience and prolonged observation. This experience also revealed the complexity of human perception. Even when faced with something improbable, the mind tends to recognize patterns, coherence, and solemnity. The passport, though unofficial, managed to cross invisible barriers of plausibility, creating an impression of legitimacy sufficient to generate partial acceptance. It was a quiet reminder that authority and recognition often depend more on perception and coherence than on formal or legal approval. The impact of this surprising acceptance was not limited to direct observers. People who witnessed or heard about the situation shared curiosity, small comments, or speculations, silently propagating the symbolic presence of the empire. Each interaction reinforced the perception of the existence and solidity of the created territory, transforming discrete gestures into a silent network of recognition. The empire, though invisible to most, began to manifest in a concrete way within the collective imagination of those who encountered it. For the protagonist, the surprising acceptance was also an internal confirmation. It was proof that patience, creativity, and attention to the smallest details can produce tangible results, even when working alone in an imaginary territory. Each seal, each coat of arms, each meticulously organized page consolidated not only the plausibility of the passport, but also the symbolic identity of his empire, strengthening the sense of silent and contemplative sovereignty. As you breathe slowly, imagine the tranquility with which he absorbed each gesture, each pause, and each nearly inaudible comment. Nothing needed to be proclaimed aloud. The acceptance, even partial and subtle, generated a profound, introspective, and meditative effect. The one-person empire advanced, invisible to the formal world, yet alive and perceptible to those who, for brief moments, allowed themselves to be touched by the coherence, aesthetics, and solemnity of his creation. And so, the surprising acceptance consolidated the silent beauty of his project, an improbable empire, carefully constructed, capable of eliciting partial and real recognition through patience, attention to detail, and quiet conviction. It was proof that, even in a skeptical and formal world, imagination, consistency, and symbolism can generate impact, presence, and meaning, almost like a silent miracle, perceptible only to those who take the time to observe calmly. After the surprising, albeit partial, acceptance, the protagonist began to contemplate the deeper significance of his experience. The one-person empire, manifested in a meticulously crafted passport, revealed that power, legitimacy, and authority often reside not solely in institutions, decrees, or rules, but in perception, coherence, and the way symbols and signs are presented. This silent perception transformed the imaginary into something tangible, almost palpable, without ever relying on complete validation. He reflected on how minimal gestures, prolonged glances, or meditative pauses can generate implicit recognition. The partial acceptance of his passport demonstrated that symbolic authority can emerge from consistency, attention to detail, and prolonged patience. Each seal, each coat of arms, each carefully crafted title functioned as a bridge between imagination and reality, creating subtle yet profound effects on the perception of those interacting with the document. It was fascinating to realize that, in many situations, the appearance of legitimacy outweighs objective formality. The passport was not officially recognized, yet it inspired trust, curiosity, and quiet respect. This introspective experience showed that power exists, in part, in the capacity to generate perception and impression. Attention to detail, silent care, and aesthetic coherence transformed symbols into instruments of perceptible influence, even if invisible to formal authority. The protagonist also contemplated the role of patience in this process. Each interaction, each silent test, each refinement and adjustment carried no rush or expectation of immediate return. The impact accumulated slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet steadily, like a tide gently shaping the sand on a beach. This meditative patience reinforced the introspective nature of his empire and allowed him to observe, with serenity, human reactions and the symbolic effect of his creations. He further considered how the empire, though created by a single person, could influence the perception of multiple individuals without fanfare. Each reaction, each silent doubt or contained curiosity functioned as a reflection of the coherence and symbolic strength of the passport. It was a reminder that influence does not always need to be explicit or formal. It can manifest subtly, contemplatively, and profoundly perceptibly, sustained by consistency and attention to detail. Moreover, the protagonist meditated on the relationship between reality and symbol. The passport, though fictitious, could produce almost tangible effects because it touched human perception and imagination directly. Each seal, each coat of arms, each title acted as a sign of authority, creating a sense of legitimacy that crossed formal barriers. This silent experience demonstrated that power often exists first as perception, before it materializes into institutional or official recognition. As he breathed slowly, he also reflected on the fragility and beauty of this construction. A one-person empire could be subtle, almost ethereal, yet its silent impact demonstrated that coherence, patience, and attention to detail are powerful tools. The real world may not officially recognize every creation, but human perception, when engaged by consistent and well-presented signs, can grant almost magical legitimacy. The protagonist concluded that his empire existed in multiple layers, visible and invisible, symbolic and perceptible, imaginary and almost real. Each interaction, each partial acceptance, each silent reaction contributed to the consolidation of this territory, revealing that symbolic authority is a powerful force when built with care, introspection, and patience. It was a reminder that perception can be as impactful as formal reality, and that solitary creation can exert influence even without total recognition. And so, as the empire advanced silently and contemplatively, he understood that true power lies not only in titles or institutions, but in the ability to generate perception, maintain coherence, and touch the imagination of others. A carefully crafted passport could, in a serene and quiet manner, evoke recognition, curiosity, and respect, consolidating the symbolic strength of a solitary and fascinating creation. We have finally reached the last chapter of this improbable story, the one-person empire and its passport that was almost accepted. Looking back at months of patience, silent adjustments, and meditative observations reveals that each small detail, each seal, coat of arms, and title, was not merely an exercise in creativity, but an experiment in perception, coherence, and the way imagination can touch reality. The legacy of the empire does not lie in official recognition or stamped approvals, but in how its symbolic existence managed to provoke curiosity, hesitation, and quiet respect. The passport, seemingly a trivial object, became a portal for reflections on power, authority, and perception. It demonstrated that legitimacy often arises before any formal approval. In pauses, in prolonged glances, in the silent attention of those encountering something built with patience and care. Every interaction, no matter how small, consolidated the sense of presence and significance of the empire, making it real in the subjective space of those who came into contact with it. The protagonist learned that symbolic power can be as influential as formal recognition. Coherence, aesthetics, and attention to detail act as signs of authority that transcend invisible barriers. With each attempt at partial recognition, every hesitation of an official, each restrained comment on the uniqueness of the passport, the empire expanded silently, touching human perception in an almost magical way. It was a reminder that creating something consistent and well-structured can generate real effects, even when the formal world seems unwilling to acknowledge the work. This story, in its calm and introspective rhythm, invites reflection on the fragility and strength of perception. Just as in the one-person empire, our own creations, ideas, and symbolic gestures can cross invisible barriers, impacting subtly yet significantly those willing to observe. Every detail matters. Every patient gesture constructs a narrative that, even if not officially recognized, exists, endures, and becomes memorable in the experience of the witness. It is curious to see how the protagonist's silent and introspective effort connects with a broader reality. Recognition, curiosity, and influence do not always come from institutions but often emerge from coherence, care, and attention to the signals we offer the world. The story of the almost accepted passport reminds us that imagination, patience, and precision can create tangible impact, even in the most improbable and absurd situations. If you have made it this far, realize that this is an invitation to contemplation. Reflect on what caught your attention most in this story. Share your thoughts or questions. This allows us to converse further about the small silent empires that each of us can create. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider subscribing to continue following real and absurd stories, told in an introspective and serene manner, capable of transforming ordinary moments into contemplative experiences. Liking the content also helps keep this channel alive, allowing stories like this to reach those seeking a moment of calm and reflection before sleep. Now, close your eyes. Feel the world outside becoming distant, and let the one-person empire and the passport that was almost accepted slowly fade into the fog of your thoughts. Breathe slowly, sensing each detail of the story dissolve gently. Each seal, each coat of arms, each page of the passport merges with memory and imagination, forming a silent legacy that remains in the intimate space of the mind. Allow yourself to float in this moment of introspection. Every hesitation, every reaction, every partial acceptance, and every adjustment of the passport transforms into a slow and harmonious rhythm, guiding your mind toward a state of serenity. The empire now exists only in the calm space of your thoughts, invisible to the formal world, yet alive and tangible in your perception. As the fog of dreams envelopes your consciousness, remember that real stories, even absurd ones, can teach lessons about patience, perception, and the power of details. Let this learning dissolve gently, without haste, without weight, as if each symbol and every meditative gesture of the protagonist follows the rhythm of your own breathing, guiding you toward a state of deep tranquility. And now, close your eyes. Let this real absurdity disappear into the fog of your dreams. Good night.